Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping you lead better every day. And now, here's your host.
Hello, friends. I'm your host, Jason Day, and I want to welcome you to another awesome episode of the Church Leaders Podcast. I had the opportunity to speak with Adam Hamilton. Adam is the founding pastor of the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas, which is a suburb of Kansas City. Now, the church was started in 1990, but it has grown to be the largest United Methodist church in the denomination, with an average weekend worship attendance of over 10,000 people. So on this week's episode, Adam shares the unique and intentional decision that he made when planting this church, which really had a significant impact on the church's development. We also get into something very fascinating, and that is why Adam gave his church leadership permission to fire him. And Adam also shares some helpful leadership lessons that he learned as he traveled through Egypt studying the life of Moses. So I know you're going to love today's conversation with Adam, so I invite you to listen in. Adam, it's a pleasure to have you on our Church Leaders Podcast. Welcome.
Jason, it's great to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate you taking the time to share with our church leaders. And I just have a quick question. You pastor the largest United Methodist Church, the Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas. Now, honestly, Adam, whenever I was kind of looking in, and this was some time ago, but I was looking at the Church of the Resurrection, and I guess I just had always imagined that it was one of the large established United Methodist churches with a long history over the years, but I learned that really this is a church that you planted in 1990, right?
Yeah, that's right. We started, my wife and I and our two children. They were 2 weeks old and 3 years old when we started, and LaVon and I were 25 and 26, and we had this dream of starting a church for thinking people who were non-religious and nominally religious, trying to find folks who were not going to church anywhere, trying to really look at folks. The community that we're located in is a pretty highly educated community, and we thought, okay, there's a whole lot of people here who think, I don't really need God and I don't need church, and maybe I'm too smart for that. And we wanted to be able to speak to their intellect and into their heart, and then to see their lives changed, and to send them out in the world to live their faith and to be witnesses for Christ and to transform our community so it looks more like the kingdom of God.
That's awesome. Now, what would you say are some of those factors that helped you go from a church that didn't exist, literally? I mean, you planted this church to the largest United Methodist Church.
Well, I think a couple things. First of all, we were in a community that was kind of the right place at the right time. Now, there were 30 other churches that started out there in our same community at about the same time, within about 5 years of that, and most of them didn't do what this church has done. But we were in a place where there was a lot of growth that was happening. We were really clear about our mission, so we had a really clear purpose that we were targeting non-religious and nominally religious people. We were looking for thinking people. We were going to speak to their intellect and then to their heart. We were doing something a little different than other churches were. So there were, at the time, Willow Creek was kind of the model for churches, and I really hadn't been to Willow Creek. I didn't know much about it. I'd actually never been to a church larger than about 300 people a Sunday in worship. But I had this idea that a lot of those non-religious people were mainline Christians who had dropped out of church in high school or college or whatever. And I thought, if we can offer worship that looks familiar, from their past, and at the same time is relevant and is passionate, and we explain certain things to them, like, why are we doing this? That might be what separates us from many of the other churches that looked kind of similar. They were all doing similar styles of worship, and so we came in, and it was against all the rules in 1990. This wasn't supposed to work, but we came in and we had a small choir. We had a little bit of liturgy in the worship services. We were clearly United Methodist, and we explained what this looked like, and it was interesting. It was sort of, when you think about ancient modern worship and that terminology today, well, we were doing that back in 1990, and people would come in and they were like, I recognize this. We used to say the Lord's Prayer every Sunday when I was growing up, or this sounds familiar or looks familiar. And at the same time, it was aimed, clearly targeted at people who weren't very active in church and trying to get them plugged in. So that was one of the things, is our clear sense of purpose. We also were clearly focused on serving the community. And so 25%, the first 25% of every dollar that came in the offering plate, and at the time, that was our first year's budget was like $50,000.
Wow.
But was going to go towards serving the poor, ministering to people in the community, those kind of things. We did a lot of direct mailing to the community and encouraged our people every Sunday to invite their friends. I planned sermon series at certain times of the year that were focused on, on answering the kind of questions non-religious people were asking. And so every year in January, right after Christmas Eve, we would, plan a sermon series like that, and right after Easter as well. And we really focused on trying to, the times when the culture is still thinking about going to church, the non-church culture is thinking about going to church, or Christmas and Easter. So we really capitalized on those in our mailings and our advertisements and all that, and our attendance would usually triple, and then we would hopefully do such a great job and do excellent follow-up that they would come back. And lastly, I would say we try to do really good follow-up with first-time visitors. So we delivered, I personally would take a coffee mug to every first-time visitor's home on Sunday afternoon after they visited Sunday morning, until we got to the point where I couldn't keep up with that anymore, and I started training lay people to do it. I did it up to about 10 or 15 first-time visitors a weekend, and then we started training lay people. After their third visit, I would get to their homes, and I would, go by and spend an hour with them, just listening to their story and sharing with them my story and what the church was about, and then praying with them. And all of those things were really pivotal in the early years, and in terms of, seeing the growth happen and people coming. And then it at some point you got so many people who were new, and they're inviting their new friends, and so it's just been. And I would say beyond that, the Holy Spirit has done something that was much bigger than any of us ever anticipated.
Right. Wow. So was the growth relatively consistent from the time you planted?
Yeah. In the beginning, the early years, we grew by about 50% a year for the first 5 years, probably, and that's not a sustain. At least I don't. Maybe it is sustainable in some churches, but I couldn't figure out how to sustain that over the long haul. So we grew. The first year. We began with about 90 people a Sunday in worship the first month, and then we were at 150 the next year, and then 275 the next year, and then 500, and then we grew from there. But then I would say, once we hit about probably 5,000 a Sunday in worship, it was down to about 25% growth in worship. We got to between 6,000 and 7,000, and we kind of, I don't know if we stalled, but we didn't see quite the same percentages of growth happening. Then we started new campuses. So we began a campus in about 20 minutes west of us, and then we began a campus in downtown Kansas City a couple years later, and then in the eastern suburbs. And at that point, our growth at the Leawood campus, the central campus, pretty much stalled. Actually, we started going down a little bit there, but all of our growth was happening at the campuses. And then we started online, and that affected us a bit too. So we had, today we have somewhere between around 3,000 people a weekend in worship online, and about 2/3 of those are our Resurrection members who are, for whatever reason, we call it Jammy Church. They're staying and going to Jammy Church, and so that's been a bit of a challenge. But we've continued to grow when you add all of those up. But the Leawood campus kind of stalled out for a while. Recently, we opened our permanent sanctuary, and the growth there has jumped up, pretty significantly in the last 2 months since we opened. But we'll see. It's been right now on an average weekend at the Leawood campus. Well, now it's summertime, but before that we were running close to 8,000 in attendance, not counting children's Sunday school. That's just physical worship attendance. And then we had another probably 2,000 at our campuses, and then another 2,000 to 3,000. Well, usually 3,000 online. That's what our attendance looks like today.
Wow. When did you start doing the multiple campuses?
That's 10 years ago, and that campus runs about 1,000 a weekend in worship. And we have a campus in downtown Kansas City that's just breaking ground on the first new church building in downtown Kansas City in 85 years.
Wow.
We're excited about that. We bought a city block downtown, and they're running close to 1,000 a weekend in worship. And then we have a smaller campus that was an existing church that was struggling and looking like it was going to die, and they asked if they could become a campus. And they voted to close and then reopened under new leadership, 2 months later, and they became Church of the Resurrection Blue Springs. And that church started with about 50, and today they're about 350 a Sunday. And that actually, I'm really excited about all of them. That one I'm really excited about because I feel like there's lots of other churches that are struggling at 50 a Sunday.
Right.
And this might be a model for helping those churches have a future.
That's excellent. As you're sharing that story, I couldn't help but think that going from, just your family and launching a church and, having about 90 on a Sunday, and now where you are today, over these, it hasn't even been 30 years now, it's
right, 27 years.
Right, 27 years. So over that span of time, how did you, as a leader, as a lead pastor, how did you keep up with just the leadership challenge of, leading a church that was, growing so dramatically?
Well, it was a constant process of delegating, of handing over things that I really enjoyed doing to other people, and trying to figure out what are the things that only I can do. What are the things that, where if I don't do this, the church is really going to suffer. Whereas if I don't do that, I'm going to miss out on something I really enjoy, but somebody else can do that. And the truth is, when you first start, and you're doing everything. Of course, everybody would love for you to be the one visiting them in the hospital. Everybody would love for you to be, and you're probably the most effective person to deliver coffee mugs to first-time visitors, because the people saw you up on the chancel, speaking and praying, and they heard you preach. And so when you show up, it's different than if somebody shows up they didn't see.
Right.
But at the same time, the nominal value of you doing those things relative to somebody else doing them is not as high as the nominal value of you, whether it's making sure that your preaching is effective or doing the higher level leadership functions or, those kind of things. And so I found I was constantly peeling off things that I enjoyed doing and handing them off to other people, and then trying to focus on what are the things that I need to do. And the truth is, along those 27 years, there are times I felt like I was failing. There are moments where I feel like I would get burned out, or I would hit a wall, and I would think, okay, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I'm clearly not getting this right now. And that happens, with some, every few years I'm in a place where, like, okay, right now I can't figure out what I got to do to change this. And fortunately I have a great staff team around me who play a key role, and our lay leaders are excellent too. But yeah, it's a different animal. I tell people that every year to every 2 years we become the next size larger church, and so you're constantly needing to read and study and learn. And I had to visit with people who were at larger churches than ours to figure out, okay, how do you do this now, or what does that look like, or what does your time look like, and so yeah, it's been a real learning curve, and sometimes I've got it right and sometimes I haven't.
Wow. Now, you've been at this same church that you planted for 27 years. That's a long time. Oftentimes pastors find themselves, moving from one church to another. Can you talk a little bit about your longevity there? Yeah.
So, I think part of the longevity, first of all, I had, early on, I had one of my lay leaders say, are you prepared for the fact that the day may come where this church grows beyond your leadership abilities and capabilities? And I said, absolutely. This church doesn't exist to give me a job, and this church is more important to me and its mission than me working here. And so my hope would be, and I told our personnel committee, I said, if the day comes where I'm no longer the best person to be the senior pastor, I need you to tell me that, because I may not see it. I won't be able to notice that, and I care so much about this mission that I'm going to ask you to I'm going to beg you to have the courage to fire me. I need you to know that the mission matters more than the senior pastor. But I'm going to ask you to give me a year, to try to fix whatever I'm doing wrong before you fire me. But I mean it. I can't convey more, any more dramatically than this, that I want you to have the courage to do what needs to happen. But I told them I want to do everything I can to try to be the senior pastor this church needs at its next journey or its next venture, or where it's going next. One of the things that was important for me was trying to take care of my family and figure out how to, because I tend to be the workaholic, put in too many hours kind of thing, and so I had to my wife would regularly be the one who would stop me and say, okay, this is not working anymore. I'm not seeing you enough, the kids aren't seeing you enough, and so paying attention to her, trying to make sure I'm taking time with the kids was important. And then our church has a sabbatical policy where every 6th or 7th year, after 6 years, so in your 7th year, you can request off up to 3 months. You're compensated during that time, but you've got to put a plan together as to what you're going to do to strengthen your family, your spiritual life, and what you're going to gain that's going to help the church. And that's been, I've taken 3 of those during this 27 years, and that's been really important as well.
Excellent. That's interesting as you talk about some of those leadership lessons and how you had to grow in leadership naturally. As things around you were growing, you too were stretched. You recently released a book on the life of Moses in the Footsteps of the Reluctant Prophet by Abingdon Press. And can you talk to us a little bit about those leadership lessons that you found as you were studying the life of Moses?
Absolutely. And I might say a word first about just the book itself. One of the callings that I've felt is to take people to the lands of the Bible, people who maybe otherwise wouldn't go to the Holy Land, or they wouldn't maybe go to to Egypt or these other places, to take them there and to help them see the biblical story in the light of the land. And any of your listeners who've been to the Holy Land know how it just opens up the Bible to you. It's they call it the fifth gospel, just a way of seeing things differently. And so I've been doing this. I've written books. I take a video team with me, and we record small group videos in each of these places. So I've been to the Holy Land for 3 of these. I've been across Turkey, Greece, and Italy to focus on Paul. For Methodist, I went to England, and I focused on John Wesley and the founding of the Methodist movement. And then one of my dreams was to get to Egypt. And I had to postpone it several years because the situation was just too dangerous to go over, or at least the State Department felt it was, and the places that I wanted to go. And so we finally were able to go last year. And then I preach a sermon series using the video footage. Then I prepare a book and a small group study on it. So the book just came out a couple weeks ago, and it's got pictures and maps and kind of helps people it includes some of the critical biblical scholarship, but it really focuses on what does this story mean for our lives today. And one of the chapters in there is on the leadership lessons from Moses, and so I thought I might just share a few of those with you and with your listeners. And the chapter speaks about the season when Moses is in the wilderness. And, these are lessons we've all thought of before, but I'll just mention a few of them. The first one that I focused on was when Moses is there at Mount Sinai, and the Israelites are coming to him. He's going up to the mountain and coming down with the directives from God, and, kind of like we pastors sometimes think we're doing when we come to preach on Sundays. And then the people are coming to him, and they want advice. They want to talk to him. They need to talk about their problems or solve the conflicts. And so you may remember his father-in-law Jethro comes over, and he watches as Moses is meeting with people from morning till night. And finally, Jethro says, look, what you're doing isn't good. You're going to totally wear yourself out, both you and the people who are with you. The work is too difficult for you. You can't do it alone. Now listen to me, and I'll give you some advice. And I love this because Jethro becomes the first management consultant in human history, at least that I know of.
Right.
And he gives the advice that every great management consultant has given to every leader, and that is you've got to delegate. And he says, you've got to find these capable people, and he lays out the criteria for them, and he says, now they're going to take care of all the lesser problems, but the more serious problems they're going to bring to you, and you're going to be happier, and they're going to be happier, and that's exactly what happens. And that's the beginning of the Jewish Sanhedrin. The ruling council is you've got 70 people that he selects as elders to help lead the way. And I think about that, and that, as we were talking just a moment ago, was pivotal in Church of the Resurrection's growth, is the ability to give away leadership and to no longer be in control of everything. And I remember years ago I was visiting with John Ed Matheson, who was leading one of our largest Methodist churches at the time, and we were running at Resurrection about 1,500 a Sunday. And I was feeling like I was losing my mind. Like, I would pull in the parking lot of the church, and there'd be hundreds of cars there, and I would have no idea what it was, what they were all there for. I felt like I couldn't keep up with everything, and I said to John Ed, who I dedicated this book to, the Moses book to, I said, John Ed, I feel like, I'm losing control. I feel like I'm not, I'm not keeping up with everything. I feel like I'm failing. And he says, listen, if in a church your size, you know everything that's going on, you don't have enough going on. And you've got to decide, is this church your church or is it God's church? And if it's your church, you just keep your arms around it, keep it the size that you can be in charge of everything. But if it's God's church, you've got to let it go and let God raise up people to be, leaders in the church.
That's good.
And that fundamentally changed the direction of Resurrection. I don't know where we would be today if it hadn't been for that. And that's what happened with Moses and the Israelites. The second thing I focus on in this chapter is what happened as the Israelites began grumbling against Moses. Mm-hmm. So we all know what this is like to have people grumbling against us. And, you can't be in leadership without people grumbling. But there are 10 times that are, and it's really interesting how clearly these are laid out in Exodus and Numbers, 10 times where the children of Israel begin to grumble against Moses. They don't like the food. There's not enough water. They wish that, at one point they're scared of the giants that are living in the promised land, and they want to elect a new leader. They're going to stone Moses, and they're going to go back to Egypt. And so you look at this story and you think, man, how often does that happen for us as leaders? And as I began to think about that, I thought, and you remember Moses goes out in the wilderness, and here's his prayer, Lord, kill me now. I am sick of these people. I can't do it anymore. It's too much of a burden. Why have you treated me so badly to put me in charge of a group like this? And there have been so many times at the church, the thing that is most discouraging for most of us pastors in particular, because we're people. We like people to like us. And so when somebody doesn't like you and they communicate anonymously or directly or behind your back or whatever else, we get defensive. We get our feelings hurt. We get frustrated. We feel like throwing in the towel. And one of the things I've found. So I'm 52. When I was 30, this stuff just ate my lunch, and I'd feel like if I got an email, 35, if I got an email, I felt like I had to spend 2 hours responding to every one of those emails and being, making my case and showing why I was right. And today at 52, I'm like, well, thanks for sharing your thoughts with me. Appreciate it. Have a good day. And there are times where I just realize I can't make you happy, but I love you anyway. And there are other times where I realize, you know what, you're right. I messed up there, and I'm really sorry about that. I'll do a better job next time. And so learning how to deal with that criticism, and the fact that I went to, in the book, I think I mentioned this, I went to look to see what is the favorability ratings of presidents across the last 100 years. And the president who across his entire presidency had the highest approval rating was John Kennedy with 70%. Eisenhower had 65%, Reagan had 55% over the course of his 2 terms. And what that means is that, a lot of people, when I ask them who's the most popular president who had the highest approval ratings, most of them think it's Reagan. Well, it wasn't Reagan, but he was not too far from the top. But even with Reagan, 45% of Americans disapproved of the job he was doing. And even with John F. Kennedy, 30% of Americans disapproved of the job that he was doing. So when we think we need to have 100% approval over the job we're doing, we're probably not doing a good job if everybody agrees with everything that we're doing. And so, for Moses, the key thing was he had to get back on the horse and go riding again. He had to keep going. And the leaders who change the world are the people who refuse to give up. They keep going. They listen. They learn. They're humble. They try to not get overwhelmed by the opposition, but they keep going. And what I find is many pastors, when they start getting criticized and these kind of things, they give up too quickly. And I remember some years ago we had a period where we lost quite a few members over a sermon that I had preached. And I did some real soul searching. Did I preach the wrong thing? Did I do the wrong thing? And there came a point I told my wife, I said, I can't do this anymore. I just can't do this for another 25 years. Is it okay if we take another job? And because at the time I was getting calls to go to do other things, and she's like, well, here's the question I want to ask you. Is God calling you to do something else, or are you running away?
Oh, yeah.
And I realized I was running away because it just hurt too much. And so I just kept putting my pants on another day and kept praying and kept moving forward. And, it's funny, that was about, 20 years, not quite 20 years ago, probably 18 years ago, 17 years ago. All of the best experiences in my ministry at Resurrection have happened since then.
Wow.
And I would have missed all those had I quit at the time. And then the last thing that in this chapter, well, there's several other things, but in this chapter, the last thing I'll mention to you is what happened when the Israelites, they're 2 years out of Egypt, and they've gone almost 2 years out of Egypt, and they're right on the edge of the Promised Land. So they're just a few miles from the Promised Land, and they send the spies into the land, and the spies go into the land, and they come back with the report that it is a land flowing with milk and honey, but the people look like giants to us, and we look like grasshoppers in their eyes. And all of a sudden the people are terrified. And part of what this reminds me of, I talked about this as being paralyzed by fear just a few miles from the Promised Land. And this is what happens to many of us, is we get scared, and in our fear, we get paralyzed, and we don't act. And, here they were 2 years in, and they could have gone right into the Promised Land, and God was with them, and God had called them to go there, but they had forgotten that. And so, paralyzed by their fear, they end up spending the next 38 years camped out just a few miles from the Promised Land. And you think about that. The 40 years, they weren't wandering all around the wilderness during that time. They were camped at Kadesh Barnea, just a few miles from the Promised Land, because they were too afraid. And I love how in your rearview mirror it says objects, are closer than they appear. But when it comes to our fear, objects appear bigger than they really are. And so the obstacles, the objects, that they look like giants to us. And somewhere along the way, we've got to remember, if God has called us, what God can do, and be willing to take risks. And sometimes you're going to fail, but most of the time you're going to succeed. And I think back to a leadership lesson I share with folks all the time that I learned years ago from Franklin Time Management course. I don't remember anything else about the course, but I remember this. They said the successful leaders are willing to do the things an unsuccessful leader is not willing to do. And it's just so simple, but it really has to do with courage, and it has to do with the willingness to take risks and to not give in to your fears. We're all going to be afraid. I feel fear. In fact, I'm writing a book right now on fear. I feel fear sometimes. I'm like, I don't want to do this. I know I'm going to take the heat for it. But the people who make a difference and the leaders who prevail are the ones who are willing to take the risks and don't give in to their fears.
That's good. When we look at the totality of Moses' life, and the reality is he didn't get to step into the promised land in the end. What does that say to us as church leaders, as ministry leaders? Well,
I think, that's a great question. So I stood up on the top of Mount Nebo in Jordan and filmed the last segment of this small group study, and the last chapter is on this very point. And one thing I'd say is God allowed him to see the promised land, from the top of Mount Nebo, which had to have been a supernatural experience because you can only see bits and pieces of it. So I think God, whether it was in his heart and his mind, God allowed him to see and get so close to it. And I think about Martin Luther King, who used that same picture of Moses climbing Mount Nebo and seeing the promised land on the last sermon that he preached before he was shot to death. So in Memphis, when he preached that final sermon, I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the other side. I've been to I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I've seen the promised land. We will get there as a people, King says. And I think the fact is we won't, actually, I hope none of us ever fully arrive at the promised land here on this side of eternity, because that means, the vision's always got to be somehow bigger and beyond where you're at. And so I think what we recognize is that everything that would happen in the future from Moses' time forward was built on his shoulders. I mean, how many times in the Gospels is Jesus either likened to Moses, or he refers back to Moses, or there's something that is influenced by Moses? I think it's like 87 times in the Gospels.
Right.
And even we as Christians, our faith is built on the shoulders of this man who ascended Mount Nebo, and he never made it into the Promised Land, but he had a vision for it, and he led the people right to the edge of the Promised Land. And I think that's what we do as leaders. We never are going to fully arrive with our people to the destination. We are constantly leading them and cajoling them and helping them and mentoring them and pushing them towards that Promised Land. And for us, the Promised Land, for Moses, I think it was always more than just a piece of real estate. It was a place where God's kingdom was lived out on earth as it is in heaven. And for us as Christians, the Promised Land is the kingdom of God. It's this vision that's bigger than we are, that we're pushing ourselves towards, we are trying to live into. We'll never fully live into it this side of eternity, but we're going to pray every day, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and we lead our people towards that vision of the Promised Land. And so I think it's okay if you don't make it. In fact, you shouldn't ever. If your vision of the Promised Land is such that you actually finally made it, your vision of the Promised Land was too small.
Wow, that's good. What encouragement would you give to pastors who are, pastoring an average church? It's not a massive church, hasn't seen tons of growth, and they're just faithfully, Sunday after Sunday, sharing the word week after week, ministering to their people. What encouragement would you give them?
Yeah. Well, I'd say in the day and time we're living in today, for many churches, it's not even just maintaining. It's today, the culture that we live in, and even for church people, the culture is that it's probably declining. The average attendance, that used to be, people who were faithful worship attenders were there 3 Sundays a month. Today it's 1.75 Sundays a month. So even if you have the same number of people, your attendance is down. And it can be discouraging in the culture in which we live, trying to figure out how do I keep doing this, and how do I, continue to reach people and do the things God wants me to do. But so a couple things I'd say. First of all, we wake up every day and say, "Here I am, Lord. Send me on your mission." And then we pay attention to look to see where it is that God is working and how God needs to use us each day, and not to grow weary in that process, but instead each morning just wake up and say, "Lord, I'm yours, and help me to make my life a prayer to you," as Keith Green sang ages ago, but allow my life to be a reflection of your love and grace. I think in terms of just some nuts and bolts things in an average church, we remember it's all about people. I mean, it's all about God, but then beyond that, ministry is all about people, and it's about relationships, and it's about caring for people. And so I find, when I'm in the hospital, and I don't get to do this very often anymore, but I'm in the hospital and I'm caring for somebody and loving them in Jesus' name, that brings me joy. When I have a chance to sit and visit with somebody and, listen to their story and just by virtue of listening feel like I had a chance to minister to them, that brings me joy, and I think it brings God joy. And so a lot of it's not these really big dramatic things that we're going to do. It's focusing on those things. One of the things I would also say is focus on your preaching. And, often our preaching gets the short shrift because we have all these, crises that come up. So every week, we've got, somebody else is in the hospital on the day that I was supposed to be writing my sermon. And so we end up getting to Saturday, and Saturday now is the worst time to try to write a sermon is Saturday night when you feel like you're under the gun. And so, what I'd say is make sure you're taking enough time to be reading, to be studying, and to have something that you feel you learned yourself and you felt like God was speaking to you that week in the sermon, as you were preparing, that you can share with your people. And when you feel like you've got a good word from God to share that speaks to people's lives and you prepared it well, that also goes a long way. And when you're feeding the flock, it goes a long way in creating a healthy, vital congregation. So, I'd say those things, and then constantly thinking about, what's one thing God wants to use us in this community to do or in the world to do in the coming year. So you've got some kind of vision of a place that you're leading people, because I find people are drawn to vision. They want to be a part of making a difference in the world, but their leaders have to help them to be able to do that. So figuring out a vision, sharing a message that's done well, and that you've really spent time reading and preparing so you've got something to offer, and remembering it's all about people and relationships. Those three things, I think, are pivotal in any size church in both keeping your own soul fed, but also in doing good ministry.
Yeah, that's good. I love that, because you're talking about being fully present with your people in the here and now, but also that stretch into God's vision for what's bigger. And I think that balance is super helpful. Well, Adam, I certainly appreciate you once again taking the time to share with us some great nuggets of leadership from your own life, your own journey, your own experience, then also from Moses as well. We certainly appreciate. If someone wants to get in touch with you, connect with you, how can they do that? What website or Twitter?
Yeah, probably I'm at Rev Adam Hamilton, at Rev Adam Hamilton on Twitter. On Facebook, it's Pastor Adam Hamilton, and if they go to my Facebook page and follow it, it's an organizational page, they follow it, they can send direct messages to me there. I try to keep up with all of those. If they don't hear back from me, then have them send, just send another one a week later, because I sometimes will find groups of those messages that I haven't got to. Most of my email goes directly through my assistant, so she makes sure that everything gets responded to. But in those social media areas, those are good ways to catch me, is at Rev Adam Hamilton and Pastor Adam Hamilton on Facebook. Excellent.
Well, thank you so much, brother. Once again, we appreciate you being with us, and thank you so much. God bless you.
Listen, it's great to talk to you today, Jason. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. Every week, as we are putting the episodes together, we're thinking of you, our pastors and ministry leaders, and striving to provide insightful and inspiring interviews as you seek to grow as a kingdom leader. So we hope you're finding value from the Church Leaders podcast, and if so, we'd certainly appreciate you taking a few moments to head over to iTunes and leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders more easily find our podcasts so they can benefit from these interviews as well. And again, we thank you in advance. If you have any comments, suggestions, or ideas for guests, I would love to hear from you. You can send me an email to podcast@ChurchLeaders.com, or you can connect with me on Twitter. So until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website, ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.